something. I do not want to speculate about Judith Butler's lesbian phallus. That's a Lacan joke. I'm not being a perv.
Or snot, why would you ever
But
be a
like,
perv?
friends, transes, gentlekqueers, we are here to finally tear down the false monument to Judith Butler and expose gender trouble for the meandering, nonsensical hogwash it truly is. I am Talia Butt, your evil radical trans feminist.
And I am Emma Zakharuk, marveled at the fact that Talia can no longer tell her joke about how she's never read Gender Trouble.
No, well, the thing is, we're actually going to begin this with a succinct
Mm.
criticism of gender trouble by Martha C.
Mm.
Nussbaum. Because what's better than a critique episode than having to do zero work for it? Like, why bother like reading gender trouble and like understanding the nuances and stuff with it if I can just cite someone else who's already turned it down for me?
I mean, yeah, obviously, as a podcast, we are all about not reading the books that we're talking about.
Exactly. I haven't read Gender Trouble. Don't worry about it. What I
Oh,
what I
okay,
have,
okay. That's a
yeah,
relief.
yeah. Yeah, what I have read is this New Republic article that was published in February 1999 called The Professor of Parody and subtitled The Hemp Defeatism of Judith Butler. So, like
Mm.
plenty of scholars and academics before me, I don't have to form my own opinions of gender trouble. I can simply take someone else's word for it.
Mm.
Wink, wink, not calling out the listeners of this podcast, of course. Y'all are fine. Y'all are great.
Yeah. Listen to us, no one else,
So,
though.
yep. Okay. So, I'm obviously not going to read out this entire article, but like let's sort of like get into the main points that Martha C. Nussbaum raises with
Mm.
gender trouble. The first one and the one that I think I have to agree with the most, having attempted to start gender trouble, I think like 5 times, is just how awful and dog water the prose is. And there's like really no defending this one. I believe there's an award. There's literally a bad prose award that Judith Butler
Mm.
won for like an awful, awful sentence.
Wait, you win it for a specific sentence? No, I
For
didn't
a
know that.
specific sentence. Yeah, I will actually read this part out.
Mhm.
Last year, Butler won the first prize in the annual bad writing contest, the very first one, sponsored by the Journal of Philosophy and Literature, for the following sentence. Hold on, time to my Judith Butler voice.
Oh,
The
okay.
The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural totalities as theoretical objects, the sentence is still going, to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed concept of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies that I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. It's still going, of the rearticulation of power. This is the kind
I
of
feel
sentence where you
like,
like forget what the beginning is by the time you get to the middle. Like
yeah, it's like,
Butler.
okay, I can sort of sense the vague direction of the point that is being made, but I can't help but feel there are probably less incomprehensible ways of saying that, whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah. Here's like Nussbaum's attempt at like rephrasing this sentence.
Mhm.
Marxist accounts focusing on capital as the central force structuring social relations depicted the operations of that force as everywhere uniform. By contrast, Althusserian accounts focusing on power see the operations of that force as variegated and as shifting over time. Which is like it's much more comprehensible. I kind of got to give Martha this one, Judith. I'm sorry. And like that's the other thing about gender trouble that like Nussbaum really brings up and that I found to sort of resonate as well. Having not read whatever, but like gender trouble, which I haven't read, is easier to read when you are already at least somewhat familiar with the points it's actually arguing, which is paradoxical, right? But that is
Yeah.
unfortunately just how illegibly and impenetrably it's written. And there's no real getting around that. Finally, we get to Nussbaum's critique of the actual content of Gender Trouble, about Butler's grand idea that everything, truly everything under patriarchy, not just gender, but sex itself, is culture. And here I'm going to read out this passage that I've specifically chosen out of the article to highlight. Nussbaum says, culture can shape and reshape some aspects of our bodily existence, but it does not shape all the aspects of it. In The Man Burdened by Hunger and Thirst, as sextist Empiricus observed long ago, ho ho ho, other people can make obscure references too. But in The Man Burdened by Hunger and Thirst, it is impossible to produce by argument the conviction that he is not so burdened. And I like that quote. It's very relevant to like some arguments that queer theorists make against gender transition, drawing from Butler's supposed statements. Continuing this Baum's article, this is an important fact also for feminism, since women's nutritional needs and their special needs when pregnant or lactating are an important feminist topic. Even where sex difference is concerned, it is surely too simple to write it all off as culture. Nor should feminists be eager to make such a sweeping gesture. Women who run or play basketball, for example, were right to welcome the demolition of myths about women's athletic performance that were the product of male dominated assumptions, but they were also right to demand the specialized research on women's bodies that has fostered a better understanding of women's training needs and women's injuries.
Okay, I
Uh-huh.
have a question. I have a question.
Yeah,
Even
go
without
on.
going into the even without going into the research part,
Mhm.
it maybe is true. Well, it's not maybe true. It is true that, for example, nutritional needs for when you are pregnant are different than when you are not, and that nutritional needs of estrogen dominant bodies and testosterone dominant bodies are slightly different. But the food we eat is cultural, so the fact that the food that is provided does not accommodate for those who are pregnant or poorly serves women is a
Mhm.
cultural product.
Well, that's the interesting bit, right? So, okay, so here
Yeah.
Martha is like sort of juxtaposing a cultural phenomenon with the real bodily phenomenon. For
Yeah.
example, the stigma against women's playing sports, that's cultural. But, like,
Mm.
women's bodies are real, and we have to do research into the bodies of women, and that research wasn't conducted for cultural reasons. Oh,
Right.
dear.
Yeah, but, like, I'm a big hater of this separation between, like, the real and the cultural because culture is real. Like,
And
I mean,
culture
yeah,
shapes and influences how you perceive the real, how you interact, how you conceptualize the real. Funny, isn't it?
yeah.
Okay, so friends, trances, and gentlekqueers. I come not to bury Butler, but to praise them. Sorry.
Possibly unbury them from the terrible prose.
Yeah, which is like well and truly their own fault, but like, okay. So, cat out of the bag, half read Gender Trouble. I did, in fact, read Gender Trouble for this episode, like a moron, because okay, look, okay. The thing is that like I mostly felt trolled by Gender Trouble by reading it, mostly in the sense that like the cultural memory of Gender Trouble and the cultural perception of Judith Butler is very detached from what's the material reality of what's actually on the page there. Ha ha ha, ironies. But like when you get in there, you realize that like, Gender Trouble's reputation as a paradigm shifting feminist text is very well earned. And yet, somehow paradoxically, all the paradigm shifting feminism in there is the stuff that people talk about the least. So,
Mm.
for today's episode of Cracked Ivory, Emma, you and I are going to try to talk legibly about some of the paradigm shifting feminism that is here in Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. So, culture, the real, the natural. This is the big focus of Gender Trouble. But like, I'll disclaimer this because I absolutely have to talk about this part of the book before I actually get into the book. I do have to disclaimer this with like, if you're someone who did not understand Gender Trouble or did not, or like bounced off of Gender Trouble or did find, as like even Martha C. Nussbaum, who is a much more well read scholar than I am, found, Gender Trouble quite impenetrable as well. That's not your fault. It's Judith Butler's fault. That is not an unfair criticism. Especially because, like, okay, so the version of the book that I read has a preface from 1999 in it. And like when I say that I felt like I was being trolled when I read Gender Trouble, it started here. Like I knew I was gonna have to talk about this because like in the 1999 preface, Butler is like so somewhat airily with a tone of disaffection. Well, a lot of people have told me that like gender trouble is like unclear and opaque. But what is clarity? Who devises the protocols of clarity and whose interests do they serve? What is foreclosed by the insistence on parochial standards of transparency as well as requisite for all communication? What does transparency keep obscure? And it's like, okay,
Are you in the pocket? Are we in the pocket of big clarity?
I
Like, you know
guess
what?
we are.
You know what? You know what? Thank God that Butler is, I don't know, American, I think, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Butler is American and white, so they cannot make the claim that asking them to write in sentences that can be read is colonial.
I mean, some people have done that. I skipped over the
Mm.
part where Butler literally says, "Oh, isn't it misogynistic to ask me to like
Oh,
conform
right.
to do a patriarchal grammar?" Or like I think they're
Of
referencing
course.
Irigaray, who is the one who said that first, because you know how Butler loves the references. Where it's like, yeah, I don't know. This is so camp. This is like okay. I am like my fondness for Judith Butler, the person, is growing as I write this. Who is in the pocket of as I read this? Who is in the pocket of big clarity stuff? But also at the same time, I can't help but feel a white hot burning incandescent rage at my core as someone who has unfortunately, for some bloody reason or another, dedicated her life to making complex topics of gender and sexuality like and transness legible to hopefully a wider audience. And it's like, you could have written in English. You could have written in English, my individual, my being, my entity. Just why? But whatever.
I like that they brought in a source for this. Like, I understand that this is how the academy functions, but this is
Mhm.
basically academy speak for actually I am smart and articulate, and it's your fault for not understanding it. Source, my mommy.
Yeah, and I will say, Judith, yes, Judith Butler is smart. No, Judith Butler is not articulate. Is Gender Trouble a good book? No, no, it isn't. I will tell you that for free. As much as I personally love Gender Trouble, am surprisingly fond of Judith Butler after subjecting myself to it and like really appreciate their feminism. You cannot, with a straight face, say that Gender Trouble is a good book. It is not. Judith Butler, in their very own 1999 preface that I was just talking about and reading from, admit that the second chapter goes nowhere, does not tie into the. Well, okay, they say most critics say that the second chapter goes nowhere. The book is about three chapters and does not tie to the main thesis. And I guess I agree with them. I don't know. They said in a different interview that like it's impossible for them to go back and check because they don't remember writing Gender Trouble and they don't remember much of Gender Trouble and they never reread stuff that they've written. So who can say what is in Gender Trouble? Once again, am I being trolled? Is Judith Butler a social
Honestly,
experiment?
I
Is
know.
Judith Butler
I know.
performativity art? Like,
Uh, uh, I mean, honestly, yeah, I kind of get it. I also I respect the grind. It is incredibly camp. If I was working with them in a professional capacity, I would strangle them
oh yeah,
for saying I don't read what I wrote. I don't remember what I wrote. Was this chapter making a point? Fuck it, me if I know.
yeah. Once again, this is the true contradiction at the heart of Judith Butler. You love them at the same time as you want to throw a book at their head, their own, preferably. So like, but it's also like I don't know. Like there are people who should like know better, like very smart, very learned people, even like Martha C. Dusbaugh, right? Who's like
Mhm.
I like that article to be totally honest with you. I like the prose in it. I like Martha Nussbaum's clarity and her like conviction about about the necessity of like legal feminism and organizing and affecting actual material changes that affect actual real people instead of getting mired in theoretical labyrinths, which is something that they accuse Judith Butler of. But like, like we'll get there. But like, I don't think this is something you can necessarily accuse Judith Butler of themselves entirely fairly. But like even Martha C. Nussbaum was like, oh, not everything is cultural. Some things are culture, and some things like this are not culture, even though they're clearly influenced by culture. And the problem clearly is that like a lot of what Butler is saying in this book is something that people really struggle to wrap their minds around, not necessarily because they don't have the intellectual capacity for it, but because it's something that makes them very uncomfortable. It makes them very uncomfortable to try and reevaluate something so fundamental as the idea that bodily difference. Like, I did not finish reading excerpt from the article, but like what Martha C. Nussbaum basically argues is that everything can't be culture because bodily difference is real, and we know where that leads. That's where we, like, have to start with Judith Butler, right? A lot of people misunderstand Butler. So, like, let's try to cut through the bullshit, right? If I actually had to try and summarize what Butler is overall trying to do in this book, is that they're attacking the natural. So
Mhm.
I'm not necessarily best positioned to historically contextualize this work. It came out in like I think like different sources are like Gender Trouble 1989, other sources are like Gender Trouble 1990. I'm going to say 1990, but it came out like right at the very tail end of the second wave. There was still like a lot of like, the sex wars were still happening. There was still a lot of cultural feminist hangover. The third wave was sort of like starting to rouse and rumble. Like, and that's actually the reason we're talking about Gender Trouble, right? Gender Trouble, alongside with Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth, for some reason, is considered one of the sort of like foundational texts of the kicking off the third wave. And it's very confusing, but we'll deal with that later. So what Butler is basically trying to do is like trying to introduce this idea once again into like more academic, more formal like discourses that the natural is in and of itself a product of culture. Does that mean anything to you? Like, am I making sense to you right now?
Well, to me at least, I interpret that to mean that what we believe to be natural is a product of our culture. Like, so to pick a completely random example, that, trans people are their gender, and like, trans women are women, or whatever it is they say, or like trans women identify as women, but the female biological sex is natural and real.
Mhm.
Like, that's a cultural product. It's not that trans women's bodies are less real or even less female than cis women's bodies, but rather the designation of what is natural and what is unnatural is cultural.
Yeah, and like this particular aspect of gender trouble is one that I like don't see people talk about very directly, or at least in non-obtuse terms, because like when people think gender trouble, the words that like are immediately conjured for a lot of folks who are familiar to different degrees with gender trouble are the words performativity. Like, oh, that's not
Mhm.
what performativity means. Arguments about the word performativity, which like some folks who I agree with have argued Butler should never have used frankly, or drag, and somewhat misunderstanding what the Butler is trying to achieve by bringing up drag in the very end.
I was under the impression that drag was mentioned a lot. Even I haven't read Gender Trouble, so don't have an impression of the book itself. It's mentioned a lot in relation to Gender Trouble, so I had the impression that it was a prominent part of the argument somehow.
Yeah, once again, this does goes back to the book's faulty construction. A lot of the like arguments that Butler makes, they're scattered throughout and they're surrounding this like dense, rotting, blighted core of psychoanalysis of Freud and Jacques Lacan that simply does not have anything to do with any of the feminism that they're actually referencing, to put it bluntly. Like the first chapter of Gender Trouble is like relatively easy to follow despite the bad prose.
Is the psychoanalysis the chapter 2 that critics say doesn't do anything or lead anywhere?
Pretty much. And like that's the impression that I got while I was reading it. Apparently, like I have the record amongst my friends for like actually reading that chapter until I finally cracked and started skimming. Apparently, like people do that way quicker. But like, yeah, it's just nonsense. I don't understand why Butler is talking about Freud and Lacan and psychoanalysis so much. I have a theory, and like I think it's basically like I think Gender Trouble is a book that didn't really need to be a book, right? Because like there's a 1988 paper where Butler makes makes the arguments in Gender Trouble like better and more succinctly. And Gender Trouble is basically that 1988 paper stretched out to an entire book with a lot of like references to a lot of like heady continental philosophy stuff and like a bunch of psychoanalysis jammed in the middle. And I think that's because like I don't know, like, Freud isn't like really relevant to a lot of like psychology anymore. Obviously empirically, Freud is not very like sound. But I don't know, it seems to have a lot of purchase in philosophy and like, the big boy pants disciplines. I'm speculating a little bit over here, but like I feel like Gender Trouble was like genuinely Butler's attempt to like giving feminism a certain kind of academic legitimacy that it, has never really truly enjoyed. And honestly, they failed in that. Like and,
Mhm.
that is like that part wasn't their fault. Like, feminism is just not a topic that's ever gonna be, like, treated with as much legitimacy as feminists might want it to. shrug. And like I feel comfortable saying that if Judith Butler can't do it, then I don't think the rest of us have much of a shot. So maybe let's not worry about legitimacy so much anymore. But the first chapter of Gender Trouble is actually relatively easy to follow. So the first chapter of Gender Trouble is Butler putting Wittig, Irigaray, and Simone de Beauvoir into conversation. And it's very interesting and also a bit like funny and weird at times because Butler is like really focusing on the difference in philosophies between Wittig, Irigaray, and de Beauvoir. Apparently, like Wittig and Irigaray had beef as well. They were contemporaneous apparently, and it's just like I don't know. I'm like reading the stuff, and I'm just like these gals agree on like 99% of things, and they're like quibbling over the 1%. And I'm just like, I mean, I understand that. That is the kind of difference of opinion that makes like lifelong beef. Like I get it.
What difference of opinion?
Specifically about like okay, so you know these are like they're all writing largely in the materialist feminist tradition. As a, I think there are people more familiar with Irigaray who would like punch me for saying that, but I mean it's all kind of like interrogating natural womanhood, right? And like that's the sort of like other frustrating thing about Gender Trouble is that as you read it, you realize that we are revisiting an argument that like feminists have had to have over and over again ad nauseum, which is that this idea of like the natural female body or some kind of like natural feminine essence that is being culturally repressed by patriarchy and needs to be sort of set free. And that the goal of that the goal of feminism is effectively to liberate the naturally suppressed womanhood. And that kind of idea of like natural womanhood or natural femininity, it assumes a lot of things about what women are, right? Or like what interests women share as a class. And I think before you even get into the sort of like the gender of it all, the big thing that obviously becomes apparent and is why Butler is invoking a theorist like Wittig is that very often this idea of natural womanhood, natural femininity, it comes from heterosexual prior, doesn't it?
Hmm. Yeah.
The idea that like women want to pursue fulfilling mutual relationships with men in a happy heterosexual coupling and pop out kids and a lovely family unit. Natural womanhood. So, we can understand why exactly a theorist like Butler would want to complicate or queerness narrative, right? The Wittig and Irigaray part that like Butler was saying is like Irigaray says that there is only one sex and that women are not women are positioned outside of patriarchy, while Wittig says that women are like constructed within patriarchal bounds to be subservient. And it's just like it's one of those things that's just like okay, so we're like arguing semantics here. Or like we're arguing things that are like more true in some contexts and not true in others. Like, okay, let's go back to like a medical research example. Like, oh, technically, like if like research is only done on quote unquote male bodies,
Hmm.
medical research is only done on male bodies, then technically women are being excluded from like the purview
Yeah.
of like natural from like humanity itself. But also sometimes, women are just seen as like man with man, but with lack, a lesser, more disabled, more dependent, more infantilized form of man.
Hmm.
And it's just like, I don't know. I feel like these girls are kind of just saying the same thing in different words.
Yeah, it kind of feels to me a bit like I think I've said before that you can, if you wanted to, you can count any number of genders in patriarchy. You can say that there's
Uh-huh.
only one gender and it is man, and everyone else is defined by their relationship to man. You can say that there's a jillion genders, that father is a gender, that son is a gender, that boy is a gender, and girl and mother and crone and whore and whatever are all different genders. Either of those framings would be correct to some extent. It's a way to model social relations under patriarchy, and neither of them is wrong or right. It's more like a question of like, okay, once you establish this model, what are you trying to say with it? And like one may be more helpful than another in to a certain purpose, right? So it
Mhm.
kind of feels like arguing which one of them is the true unified theory of patriarchy, basically. It's kind of like, oh, what's the point? It's like
Yeah.
we're just trying to model and theorize about real phenomena. So real phenomena come not to be like some things are real, but like I mean the things that happen in society take precedence over the models. And in that sense, arguing about which model is the most correct one feels like missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, that's like a really easy thing to fall into, right? Just to at some point roll your eyes and start like, okay, but like, can we talk about real things? Sometimes that impulse is a bit merited. Like I've done my best while reading this text to give Butler as much the benefit of the doubt as I can. And like I really thought about, okay, what is there utility to trying to determine whether Wittig was more right or Irigaray was more right? And I have struggled to care because like the more interesting stuff over here is the stuff that like Butler is adding on or restating or reiterating anyway, right? Butler is asking, are there natural drives? Are there natural sexes and sexualities? And are there even quote unquote natural bodies before culture? Is it possible for us to ever access a natural pre-discursive space, or can we not, in fact, escape patriarchy? Dollface.
What was your joke quote actually right? Well, not right in the sense that Butler says this, of course they don't, but like
Yeah, again,
in
I
spirit.
just like I have absorbed enough of like gender trouble and also like, the feminism it influenced by osmosis that I kind of like as it turns out, you can't escape patriarchy. Dollface is probably a relatively good one sentence summary of gender trouble. Shoot me, I'm a genius. But while we're on the topic of Wittig and Irigaray, I do actually want to talk about. Obviously, this is a big fixation of Butler, specifically because of the lesbian question, because of feminism's inevitable tendency to drift back towards the heterosexual norm, to become the feminism of mothers rather than the feminism of the
Mm,
misogynized, let's say.
mhm.
But at this particular point in time in history, I think it is easy to tell where Butler's frustrations principally stem from, which is that, they don't like talk about this in like very clear terms. They don't talk about anything in clear terms. But it's like this is also around the time where like a lot of like lesbian feminist nonsense was centered around the question of like, is enjoying penetration evil?
Yeah, I remember those.
And I do not want to make any assumptions about like Judith Butler's sexual proclivities. They are butch. That doesn't necessarily mean something. I do not want to speculate about Judith Butler's lesbian phallus. That's a Lacan joke. I'm not being a perv.
Or snot, why would you ever
But
be a
like
perv?
but like the sheer frustration with which Judith Butler is like, oh my God, you don't have to cede penetration to the realm of the quote unquote like heterosexual or the realm of the natural or like to the realm of the artificial even as like Wittig does. Because like, apparently a big part of like the beef between Wittig and Irigaray, or like maybe this was one of the points that they agreed on. It's hard to keep straight, but it was like about this idea of like a natural female sexuality that like isn't dependent on penetration. Apparently, Wittig was famously once asked after a lecture, "Do you have a vagina?" And she said no.
This is the platonic, like, not opposite, I guess, but like a platonic complementarian partner to Lady Gaga's "Do you have a penis?" Maybe I do. Who cares? you know.
But yeah, it's because like okay, this like question about like whether or not it was evil to like enjoy penetration drove a lot of feminists absolutely insane. And like Butler's answer to this is just like it's a bit wrapped up in the question of like, this like canard that like butches very commonly get, right? Of like butches as like man imitators of butches as like people who are smuggling heterosexuality into lesbian culture, which is also and unknowing anxiety that was very common at the time. And I like again, I recognize these frustrations, and Butler's answer to this was, to accusations about like butch femme being heterosexual. Well, butch femme isn't a copy of something natural. Butch femme is perhaps a copy of a copy. Because there is no natural. Because if you say that butch femme is artifice, if you say that butch femme is a replication of heterosexuality, heterosexuality itself is artifice. The rituals and the practices of heterosexuality are no more natural than butch femme are. Boom, boom, boom. I don't know. I read that part of the book. I highlighted it. That was a mic drop moment to me.
Yeah, because like here's the thing: if you're in this sort of like butch femme is a reproduction of heterosexuality that invades lesbian spaces, it's sort of there is an assumption that like the rituals that straight people perform are
Mhm.
natural, and lesbian couples unnaturally imitate them, rather than there is a cultural idea of the masculine partner and the feminine partner and what they are supposed to do to each other. And that cultural idea permeates everyone regardless of their sexuality, and what they do with it and how they actuate their own ideas of gender and sexuality into it is kind of just a product of when their individuality meets the cultural expectations that they grew up with. But it's not something that a specific kind of lesbian brings into lesbian spaces or whatever. It's just kind of how we reproduce culture in general, regardless of sexuality.
Yeah, and it's, like, very interesting. So, like, I think that was, like, a really good clap back in 1990. A lot of the best lesbian feminism is just, like, pure frustration and spite and clapback, and that was a good one, Judith. But looking back on this stuff in the big 2026, I have to say, there are some cultures in Asia where men are starting to get electrolysis because facial hair is no longer considered attractive and are, starting to like imitate the stylish masculine affect of butch lesbians. I don't know. Is heterosexuality an artifice based on butch femme? So that was chapter one. That was Judith Butler sort of like setting up this question, trying to basically beg feminists, hey, this obsession that the natural we have is not really that good for feminism. Because if we think about it, if we continue to just simply place heterosexuality, as you said, at the center of feminism as this like natural thing that is not the part of society and therefore cannot be changed, we do kind of screw ourselves. We shoot ourselves in the foot, and it has resulted in a lot of feminisms where like a lot of feminists have said even now that like, oh yeah, patriarchy is basically the suppression of natural female energies. The beauty myth by Naomi Wolf, the book that Gender Trouble is like paired with for some reason, argues the exact opposite of gender trouble. It is pervasive with this idea that natural female sexuality, whatever the hell that's supposed to be, free of penetration, enjoying penetration, I don't know anymore. But the idea that like patriarchy is a result of like natural female sexuality being suppressed by evil male supremacist law and culture, and that we simply need to set it free to achieve equality. And like, Butler and Wittig and materialist feminists and like, gals like me are all like, the hell are you talking about?
You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of, like, since we're talking about sexuality, this sort of uneasy relationship that, like, queer people in general and women, queer or not, have to the question of, are your sexual habits and preferences informed by trauma or not? Because everyone who isn't cishet men, and in some cases even cishet men, actually probably in many cases cishet men too,
Mhm.
have a at least partially traumatic relationship to sexuality because patriarchy is traumatizing to live in, and it chiefly concerns sexuality and sexual
Mhm.
expression and behavior. So nobody's sexuality is not at all informed by trauma. But then from this, there is a kind of Butlerian sort of relationship here between the natural and the artificial, right?
Mhm.
Where people take that to mean that the parts of my sexuality that are informed by trauma are artificial impositions that must be shed, and beneath them there is a pure, undistilled version of me that, this is kind of an understandable impulse because trauma doesn't feel nice, and like there's this idea that there is a pure, undistilled version of you untouched by all the bad things that you could only achieve if you
Mhm.
shed all this baggage. It's very tempting. It's not real. It kind of sucks, but like there is no version of you that didn't grow up in the society that you did.
Yeah, and it's like, you could kind of even end your read of Gender Trouble at chapter one. We're literally going to skip chapter two, by the way. Like neither Butler nor I were joking. It adds nothing to the thesis of the book. But like that is the question that Butler is setting up, or like responding to this commentary on this quixotic feminist quest for tabula rasa, for the pre-discursive natural feminine, for the pre-lapsarian matriarchy or the pre-colonial genderbread wonderland, all of these quests that we keep inventing over and over for this idea, if we just get back to the fucking womb, untouched by all the ravages of culture, we are going to solve this, right? Right, daddy? Right, mommy?
Right. So then Judith Butler has a lapse into Freud and talks about him for some reason, and then we go to chapter 3.
Yeah. Well, okay. I do think we're going to talk a little bit about chapter two because I think the
Okay.
Julia Kristeva part that I am Gonna discuss right now is technically in the psychoanalysis section, and I think this is like literally the only part of it that's worth excavating. If you have some suggestions about like other relevant parts of chapter 2 of Gender Trouble that I missed and did not discuss, keep them to your damn self. I don't give a fuck. Shut up. Who is Julia Kristeva? Not 100% sure. A psychoanalytic feminist, if I had to guess, really. But like this is a chapter where Butler basically explains and lays out all the stuff that chapter 1 was really only setting up through like the body politics of Julia Kristeva, as they said. Kristeva is someone who uses psychoanalytic theory, like Freud or Lacan, one of the two, I'm sure, to talk about or posit a maternal body prior to discourse that exists its own causal force in the structure of drives. What does that mean? I don't know, and I'm
What?
not gonna attempt to understand what this means in in psychoanalytic terms. But basically, Butler here explicitly lays out how lots of feminist projects keep trying to seek or find or replicate this pre-discursive natural before patriarchy happened, before cultural happened, where if we return to it, we will clearly be free. And they're asking, okay, like I tend to ask like, is there a point to returning to that? My question would be like, well, if the pre-discursive natural led to this culture, how can we be sure that it is necessarily better if it inexorably led to patriarchy and all of this stuff? But Butler straight up asks, can we ever get back there? Is that practical? Is that pragmatic? Is that realistic? Because like, let's talk about realistic feminism. Let's talk about realistic feminist goals for a second. Right?
Yeah, there's also like a question here of like there was this almost Victorian like I don't know division between or not even like but it just reminds me of the Victorians between like the pure animalistic natural and the artificial civilization, if that makes sense. But like you could in the same vein argue that cultural formation is natural to humans and you can observe animals have what can only be described as cultures. Both like the more intelligent animals, like our closest ape cousins, basically, and like dolphins and shit, and like ants who are significantly dumber than us individually, but still have something that you could describe as culture if you wanted to.
Mhm.
And then there comes the question, is the division between like if that is what we observe in nature in other species that are related to us, and even the ones that are very distantly related to us, is there really a division between the pure natural animalistic and the artificial divine cultural? I think there might just not be. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, and like I think this is a very cognizant point because through this obsession with the natural, we have repeatedly, constantly gotten reactionary feminism, and like
Hmm.
Butler hasn't written "Who's Afraid of Gender" yet. In 1990, they waited all the way until 2021 to actually rewrite Gender Trouble in plain English. But in Who's Afraid of Gender, Butler talks about the gender critical movement and what is the gender critical movement obsessed with, but the supposed pre discursive natural, free of gender ideology and trans rights activism. And okay, let's talk about Martha C. Nussbaum again, right? About Butler's supposed non-material ideas floating above the real feminism and the real work that we all must achieve. Are we achieving real feminism and real work if we continue to assume that the natural state for women is heterosexual and reproductive and, one way or another, subservient to the interests, if not of men, then to, of the community, the state? There are, modes of society which plenty of people in the West have hypothesized would be more egalitarian, more communal, in which women are still treated as a kind of communal reproductive property. Like perhaps the reification of the natural, perhaps this idea that there is a telos to gender, this idea that this body difference is inevitable and arises from the simple facts of biology rather than the meaning we ascribe to bodies. Perhaps it's not as liberatory as we think, Nussbaum, even in the realm of your so called real and legal. And, maybe that's why you actually got as fucking insecure about gender trouble as you did. And, like, I'm sorry, I've read much fewer scholars than Martha C. Nussbaum going into this book, but, like, I wasn't fucking, like, pissed off or like made to feel small by not getting stuff. Most of it didn't make a difference. But like you can very clearly see, like, not to be an ass, but you can very clearly see in Martha C. Nussbaum's critique of gender trouble, this like cloying defensiveness, this like horrendous insecurity that crops up. What if I'm not getting Butler? Surely that can't be it. Surely Butler's talking nonsense. And it happens to a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, I think like people do tend to fall on either like when they don't understand something, it's like, oh, I must be stupid. This person must be smarter than me. I will simply parrot their talking points and not really try to understand them because I'm stupider. Or they're just like, this must be bullshit. I cannot possibly be stupider. Like there's like inside of you are two wolves.
Yeah, and like honestly, let's go further. Gender critical feminism, quote unquote, as it calls itself, is a project that is very concerned with the real. It has none of the lofty intellectual, philosophical, amaterial trappings of Judith Butler's feminism. Which one do we think is actually more useful in the present moment?
Actually, kind of speaking of that, and tell me if I'm jumping ahead too much. I wanted to
Mhm.
ask, what's the performativity debacle? What is
Right.
performativity according to Judith Butler? Why do you think it was a mistake to use it, and why do people misunderstand it so much?
Okay. Well, that's actually a really good transition because we're done with Julia, the mention of Julia Kristeva, and like we're
Hmm.
now getting into chapter 3. You are skipping perhaps a little bit ahead though, because before we get to chapter 3 and performativity,
Hmm.
first we need to stop and talk about Foucault.
Oh, so can we not?
Unfortunately, we do have to because okay, so this is an actual note from my read of Gender Trouble.
Right.
Foucault had some bangers. Shame about the everything else.
Okay, what were the bangers?
Okay. The notion of sex made it possible to group together, in an artificial unity, anatomical elements, biological functions, conducts, sensations, and pleasures. And it enabled one to make use of this fictitious unity as a causal principle, an omnipresent meaning. Sex was thus able to function as a unique signifier and as a universal signified. That's Foucault. I'm sorry, but
Yeah, I agree
uh,
with that.
I no, I just had to like sit there just staring into the middle distance being like, God damn fucking Foucault clears like 80% of feminism. Fuck me.
Sometimes, I have long divested of the concept of linear progress, but sometimes you like read someone say
Mhm.
something that people now struggle to understand, and you're like, God damn it.
I mean, that's the entire experience of reading Gender Trouble. And I think Butler is, yeah, it is good and it is relevant to highlight this particular part of Foucault and the history of sexuality. But lest we get ahead of ourselves, the next bit is actually Butler doing a takedown of Foucault of, or rather,
Hmm.
one specific part of something Foucault wrote that, and here's the kicker, is very similar to stuff that I wrote in The Third Sex.
Uh-huh.
Like they kind of like don't quite fully get there, but Butler in the lead up to the performativity stuff opens up a conversation with Foucault, or as they put it, reads Foucault against himself, because Foucault has a bit where they talk about an intersex person.
No.
Yep, we're now past the pre-discursive natural that we are desperately trying to sprint so far away from, and we are
Hmm.
now talking about gender as disciplining and punishment, as an imposition by an external law.
Interesting.
We are also we are also now talking about an intersex woman who okay, so let's talk about how to like refer to this person. So the names used are variously Herculean or Alexina. I'm going to stick with Herculean. And the pronouns Butler uses are S/P and H/ER. That's like
Hmm.
really confusing. I'm gonna stick to she and her just for like clarity's sake. I have never seen this pronoun protocol before or since Gender Trouble, but let's just
I
keep
think
it as simple as
actually I might have seen it. I think it was more like in vogue at that time or in that particular era of the sex wars. And it's a kind of
Mhm.
spelling that's reminiscent to me of Ukrainian feminism in
Huh.
attempting to create, not in pronouns so much, but in endings, because we have gendered adjective and verb endings. So to supply both endings at the
Interesting.
same time, what you're talking. But yeah, it's the problem with them is they are unpronounceable. When you actually try to pronounce them, they either sound like one of the pronouns, or you have to expand them and say like he or she, or like, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. I think like they is fine. They is the pronoun Butler would go on to use when
Mhm.
the youth told them what non-binary is. But I believe they themselves were still using she her at time of writing. So
Mm.
the thing that Butler is reading against Foucault is Foucault's romanticization of the story of Hercules. So Hercules is an individual with, let's just say it, ambiguous genitalia who
Mm.
had relations with women and who was eventually sort of compelled to transition to and legally identify as male, which made them very unhappy. And the story ends with Herculean suicide.
Mhm.
So obviously, man is a gender identity that Herculean was uncomfortable with. I'm not 100% sure if like gender ambiguity is something that Herculean herself or themselves chose, or if she just was never allowed to inhabit a true real womanhood. But she had something of a third sex existence, let's say. And Foucault's take on this is like it's weird. Foucault like both romanticizes and sort of like posits Herculean as having escaped the regime of sex,
Are
as
you
having
kidding me?
escaped
Are you
regulatory
ki-
sex before
Sorry?
before she was forced to transition into a man. And yeah, no, Butler had the same reaction as like anyone sane would. Can I read a
Yeah.
passage
Yeah,
that
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
Butler wrote responding to Foucault? Okay. One could argue that prior to the legal transformation of Alexina into a man, she was free to enjoy those pleasures that are effectively free of the juridical and regulatory pressures of the category of sex. Indeed, Foucault appears to think that the journals provide insight into precisely that unregulated field of pleasures prior to the imposition of the law of univocal sex. His reading, however, constitutes a radical misreading of the way in which those pleasures are always already embedded in the pervasive but inarticulate law, and indeed generated by the very law they are set to defy. Look, it's Butler. They had to make this point obtusely. But like Butler clocks, they identify that, like, okay, just because you're gender ambiguous, just because you are eligible to the regime of sex, doesn't mean you are magically free of the regime of sex. I think Butler, as a butch woman, gets this on some level. If you're
Yeah.
eligible to the regime of sex, you are not free of it. You are going to invite more disciplining, more punishment, more violence to try and make you conform or to kill you in the attempt. Arguably, Herculean experienced both of those consequences. So, what the fucking hell?
Yeah, it's like since we were talking about butch femme and stuff like that, it reminds me of Bell Hooks, where we are going to talk about later in this season. That was like lesbians escape the patriarchy by not dating men and become men. And it's like, no, well, like I get now why you're saying that Butler sees us in the book is like you can't escape patriarchy because other
Mhm.
people who are not lesbian, not gender non-conforming, not butch, etc., they imagine these non-normative existences to be liberating because they look at them from the outside
Mhm.
in. But it is it's completely grass is greener. Like,
Yep.
utterly. It's not in touch with reality of those existences at all.
Yeah, and, like, I don't quite have time to, like or, like, the familiarity to get into sort of, like, Foucault's own commentary on homosexuality and its, like, relationship to the gendered pressures of the, the faggot, the tranny, and
Mhm.
all that. But I will say this is the part that, like, drives me absolutely nuts about people, including queer theorists, who talk about gender trouble, because there is this, like, weirdly pervasive idea in a lot of queer theory texts that like okay subversion is a goal in and of itself that will free you from the
Mhm.
rigid strictures of patriarchy. There is this there's this very common idea you will encounter over and over again, that you need to be subversive, that you need to personally embody a subversive existence, that you need to make yourself gender fucky without transitioning, of course, because transitioning is conformist, but that you need to in some way become eligible to the patriarchy, and that is how you escape the patriarchy. And this is supposedly derived directly from what Judith Butler said in Gender Trouble, except I'm reading what Judith Butler said in Gender Trouble right in front of me, and they didn't fucking say that. And they said the exact opposite. What is happening? Oh my god. Oh my god.
Yeah, it's kind of I'm sure to some people a kind of depressing conclusion. If you pursue the purity of the natural, either be it like moral purity or natural purity or spiritual purity, there's all sorts of way people describe it to themselves. But like a true existence, right? But the problem is that all the building blocks you will ever get to play with are the ones given to you by your culture. And that, doesn't mean that you're doomed to be a heterosexual trad wife forever, but that this leaves the mark on you no matter what. So, like, there is no amount of subversive existence that you can do that would free you from this, I don't know, samsara or whatever. It's just kind of how it
Yeah,
is.
there's a link to a review of Gender Trouble on like either Judith Butler or Gender Trouble's Wikipedia page. I forget exactly which, where it basically says that like Judith Butler sort of kicked off queer theory's fascination with the trans subject, and that was intended as a compliment.
Mm,
But like, I do think it is true that Judith Butler kicked off queer theory's fascination with the trans subject because it is an important discursive subject for not just queer theory, all of feminism, but like they really took the wrong lesson because like, okay, I don't know. I keep finding this over and over again. There is this real fetishization, and I'm using fetish in the original term of the trans subject, the tranny, the gender ambiguous individual, the third sexed individual who has supposedly escaped patriarchy through embodying, I don't know, like, okay, the emasculate, effeminate homosexual, the one who is the penetrable male, free of the burden of gestation, but who can still be fucked and feminine. That is the sort of like apotheosis of gendered liberation under patriarchy. Except that individual has not been liberated from patriarchy. How could that individual possibly be liberated from patriarchy when that individual is abject, marginalized, impoverished, brutalized, subject to all of the fucking violence that patriarchy brings down on its effeminized subjects? It's because queer theory has absolutely no grasp of trans misogyny theory, no understanding of the oppression of the trans woman as a legible form of misogyny, and Gender Trouble doesn't quite get there, but I can clearly see the goddamn blueprints. I can see the foundation. I can see that Judith Butler had a fucking clue that apparently a lot of her intellectual, what's the opposite of antecedents? I don't know. Her intellectual successors just simply didn't. And this is the most mad I have ever been reading a piece of theory. And it's not because I'm tearing down Judith Butler. It's because I have spent years resisting the gaslighting that Judith Butler doesn't understand gender when it was all of you. Oh, okay.
Well, I'm glad that you got that out of your system. But yeah, it's really maddening. And like, I don't know if we can segue into the topic of performativity. I think like
Well,
perhaps
I mean, we
if
can. No, we can easily segue into the topic into the topic of performativity because now we're up to the part of Judith Butler's work that people misunderstand the most, even though they talk about it the most. We're up to drag and performativity. What is performativity to you, Emma?
okay, I'm gonna. We have talked about this. I remember. I forgot what was the. So this is clean slate. This is I am tabula rasa here. So performativity to me evokes the idea that something as a cultural concept is created in performing it, meaning it exists only insofar as you're doing it. That's how I understand it.
Sort of, not quite. So, okay, so performativity is a concept that is taken from like I think theater or theater studies, some discipline like that. I did read a snarky review at one point where like an academic was like Judith Butler like denies that they took this concept from theater, and I don't know why. Because it very obviously is. Probably because, like, they hate getting bogged down in this entire, like, you're calling my gender fake. And it's like, no, honey, they're not calling your gender fake. They're calling all genders fake. Keep up. But like, it's just like the chapter on drag is like it doesn't even call drag fake once. In fact, it calls drag like more real as anything else. Like, okay, the gist of the drag part of it is that like drag is not fake, but it draws attention to how all gender is fake because gender is signified culturally through repetition and ritual.
Mm.
Butler is arguing that if you call drag fake, if you call drag artifice, you have to admit that everything is as fake as real of the same stuff as drag because all gender is performative. And it's performative not in the sense of like, I am putting on my makeup and reading a script and playing a part, although, like, obviously, I can understand why that word why that understanding of performativity is evoked. But performative in the sense that like we have to do these things, we have to follow the script. We are handed a script that we have to follow, and we have to declare our gender through action, through ritual within the cultural script that we are handed. And if we deviate from that script, there are consequences. That part is also in Gender Trouble. And a lot of people who haven't read Gender Trouble think that, like, "Oh, well, if all gender is performative, can I just do a different performance?" You can. If you want the director to like hit you with a rolled up newspaper, this metaphor is stretched to breaking point, but you get my point. Like, at no point in Gender Trouble is Judith Butler calling like transness fake, but that is of or like, even like the quote unquote the play that queer people do with gender fake. They are simply saying that like it is all derived from the same cultural substrate because there is no natural, there is no real. There's only the culture and the culture that we are conscripted into reproducing, and there's only what we can make of it and how we can change it. Going back once more to Martha C. Nussbaum's critique of Judith Butler, the reason that Martha C. Nussbaum is so pissed at Butler because they think that this is defeatism. They think that Judith Butler is saying that everything is culture, there's no natural. That means the natural order can never be changed. And it's just like you have to misread Gender Trouble spectacularly to walk away with that conclusion. Because Gender Trouble is not a book with very good prose, but it's got such a hopeful, such a beautiful ending that there were actual tears in my eyes as I read it. Can I read you some of the final passages of Gender Trouble, Emma?
Yep, go ahead.
Genders can be neither true nor false, neither real nor apparent, neither original nor derived. As credible bearers of those attributes, however, genders can also be rendered thoroughly and radically incredible. They're not saying it's all fake. They're not saying it's all hopeless. They're saying that this is our world and we have the power to change it. How the fuck could you miss that? Ugh,
Yeah, that sentence wasn't like inscrutable or bad. They didn't even quote
no.
anybody.
When Judith Butler shuts up and stops referencing other people for 5 goddamn seconds, they produce beautiful things. I wish they had done that a little bit sooner. I have one critique of substance. Like, okay,
Okay.
I do think reading Gender Trouble was ultimately both a total waste of time and a transformative experience for me. It
Mm.
made me unpack and question things about my own gender that I had been refusing to unpack and question. Whatever, I wear suits now, it's fine. But I will say that I do have one critique of substance.
Mm,
Besides the whole, like, you could have said this all simpler if you had just sort of like focused on the feminism instead of like, getting sidetracked into a psychoanalytic quagmire.
mm,
And it's this one specific passage, also towards the end, I think, end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, somewhere around here. Butler says this. At stake is not whether it still makes sense strategically or transitionally to refer to women in order to make representational claims on their behalf. The feminist we is in quotes, the
mm.
feminist we is always and only a phantasmatic construction, one that has its purposes, but which denies the internal complexity and indeterminacy of the term and constitutes itself only through the exclusion of some part of the constituency that it simultaneously seeks to represent. Was that clear enough, or like should I translate from Butler speak?
I sort of understand, but I think it's better if you translate from Butler speak.
Yeah. So I highlighted this and I labeled this original sin of queer theory.
Mm,
So I like Butler's attack on the natural. I like Butler's disruption of the idea that there is some pre-discursive natural womanhood or natural female that we need to get to. But in this passage, Butler is saying that feminism necessarily, in trying to represent a constituency, gets a little essentialist. It tries to draw boundaries, right? And those boundaries might necessarily exclude some people who would be better served being represented by feminism. It's sort of legitimate point in one way, in the same way that categorizing anything is going to result in inclusion and exclusion. That's just sort of trouble with drawing boundaries. And I think liberal feminists like Bell Hooks, who we will discuss later, tried to sort of answer this by saying feminism is for everybody. We are all feminist subjects, and that is certainly an approach you can take, though one that I don't think has been very effective. But the way that like queer theory interprets this particular part of Butler. So like some people have said this outright. There's a trans studies paper by Marquise Bay that kind of reads like a confession. about this
Mhm.
idea that queer studies and trans studies are supposed to disrupt feminism, are supposed to disrupt and make obsolete the category of woman itself. And that's all that's very interesting, right? Is feminism because we have reactionary feminism, so womanhood is defined in conservative patriarchal terms. Shouldn't we just try that?
I would also say there is reactionary queer theory too. This is not being reactionary, is not special to feminism. But
Uh-huh.
what this reminds me of a couple things. The whole thing of like queer theory must disrupt feminism. It reminds me of like I'm sorry to bring up this example, but like leftist squabbling that is like in de facto weakens whatever movement it's trying to actually do because they're like feminism is 2% more dominant in our particular niche of society. We must disrupt it. But like what it actually looks like from the outside is a bunch of idiots not working together to a common cause. Like I'm really sorry. Like
Mhm.
I am absolutely not the kind of person. Like if you know what my fucking work is, you should know that I'm not the kind of person that's like we should never ever disagree about anything on the left and having any conversations about the things that some part of the movement might be failing is bad and wrong and we should just all shut up about it until we win. Like I'm not saying that, but at the same time being like we must disrupt feminism, it's like oh my god, you're so stupid. The other thing is that like okay, my personal position on the whole, like, should feminism be about women? It's like, it is, in my opinion, in my educated opinion, okay? It's not that feminism should or should not be about women, is that by virtue of what patriarchy constructs the woman to be,
Mhm.
feminism arises as a pushback on behalf of that which patriarchy constitutes as women. It is not that it creates women, but rather that arises in response to what a woman is.
Or what a woman is supposed to be under patriarchy.
Yeah, yeah,
So Emma, that was obviously skipping to the head and getting the right answer because, you're a radical trans feminist, you know this stuff. But I have
yeah.
two responses. One,
Mhm.
queer theory and even Butler in the sentence, I'm not going to absolve them here. Queer theory and even Butler in the sentence are laying the blame at the feet of feminism instead of patriarchy for
Yeah.
constructing this notion of the woman whose interests must be represented. But also, Crenshaw in that 2011 paper we discussed all the way back in the Crenshaw episode, as well as
Mhm.
Gayatri Spivak before Gender Trouble came out, talk about this notion that like Spivak defines as strategic essentialism. Because like even in post-colonial theory, even in anti-racist discourses, the idea that like, race is this homogenous unified thing, it strains a little bit of belief. Like, there are enough people who can be unified under these constructed notions of race under white supremacy whose political interests align, but there's plenty of contradiction and heterogeneity within race itself. And Spivak calls this grouping together for the purposes of like anti-racist or anti-colonial activism, strategic essentialism. Sometimes you
Mhm.
just have to draw your bounds in order to be able to get anything done. And those bounds should always be critiqued and always expanded when they need to. Like I am a victim of someone who has been excluded from these bounds drawn as a trans woman and as a brown woman and even as a lesbian woman. Like, feminism has had many opportunities to cast me out of its bounds, but a certain degree of strategic essentialism, as Spivak says, is necessary. I don't think that this is a great call to destroy the foundation of hegemonic feminism for y'all, because feminism isn't hegemonic; it is very marginal. And this is something that, like, when trans studies and queer studies have been critiqued, plenty of these theorists will yap about how marginal a field trans studies and queer theories are, but then y'all are turning around and being like, "Ah, we must disrupt feminism and the subject of feminism as the woman." And I think it's very interesting. Okay, I'm going to say this in an essay in the future, but y'all can have it for free now or 2 weeks early on Patreon. I find it very interesting that queer theory, that the trans theorists in queer theory and trans studies who are disproportionately transmasc keep talking about complicating queering and destroying the feminist notion of the woman, but have jack shit to say about abolishing manhood. I wonder why that might be.
Yeah, and like, accusing women of basically in feminism and otherwise to perpetuating patriarchy by notion of being women or affirmatively stating that they are women. It feels a little self-interested, let's just say.
Imagine a Marxism that says that you reinforce capitalism by agreeing to work for a wage. Imagine a Marxism that always says we must abolish the working class instead of saying we need to abolish the bourgeoisie. Imagine a system, a discipline, a theory of liberation that fails to name the oppressor at any turn. And I don't give a fuck what your petty, pathetic, insecure reasons for shying away from this is. You are all fucking wrong, and I do not want to hear abolish womanhood out of a single one of your mouths until you have said abolish manhood 100 times first.
I believe I've mentioned it on a completely different podcast. I think actually in our interview about Greek retellings of all things, but I will repeat it now because that's our least listened to episode actually. So I'll say it here. Patriarchy, similarly to the subject of Marxism and stuff like that, at least it partially orients itself around labor and power. And in that sense, remember when I mentioned that you can, if you want to, understand patriarchy as something that has only one kind of person and gender, man, and then everyone else is defined by what they do for man or who they are towards in relation to man. You cannot possibly abolish womanhood or faggothood or trans womanhood or trans manhood or you can't abolish any of those things so long as man exists, because the purpose of man is to dominate and to extract labor and to be more than other people. So long as man is a thing that exists, it needs to be more than someone. It needs to take someone's labor. It needs to be better than something. And so by virtue of there being man, there must be things that are worse, that are exploitable, that are degradable. Because that is the point of man's existence as a concept. So without abolishing manhood, you can't abolish jack shit.
But Emma, I am a queer theorist, and I think manhood is neat. And also, my discipline has fundamentally misunderstood the text that is said to be its foundational text. Don't be mad at me. I'm just a little birthday boy. Okay, whatever. I like Judith Butler. I like Judith Butler, the person. That whole big clarity joke, I'm sorry, made me mad, but I love it. I think Judith Butler is iconic. I think Judith Butler is camp. And I think Judith Butler's feminism is as relevant in 2026 as it was in 1990, because we've spent the intervening decades completely squandering the feminist, queer, and trans movements. Let's stop. Let us reckon with what Judith Butler actually had to say, despite their best efforts to prevent us from understanding it. That is what we should do right there.
Listen, on some extent, I can empathize with Butler being like, I was just shooting my shit. This wasn't meant to be a best-selling book. I wasn't meant to be a fucking oracle. I was just doing my thing.
Yeah, well, sometimes you have to rise to the occasion, Jude. I don't know what the fuck to tell you.
Well, I think, like, as far as I know, they kind of did. Like, they've kept rewriting and, like, rehashing the points that they were trying to make in Gender Trouble, like 20 quintillion times, and then finally they put out Who's Afraid of Gender, which I also haven't read, but I heard that it's more comprehensible than Gender Trouble and makes the same points more or less.
It's far more comprehensible. The first chapter of Who's Afraid of Gender explains a lot of what's in Gender Trouble much more like, I don't know, like, the entire time you read Who's Afraid of Gender, if you've read Gender Trouble, there will always be a voice in the back of your head constantly going, was that so hard, Judith? Was that so hard, Judith? Was that so hard, Judith? But, like, I don't know. Even despite all, we simply must stand. We simply must stand a monarch who asks the real tough questions about who is in the pocket of big clarity. I am Talia, but your evil radical trans feminist, and fuck me, I've read Gender Trouble.
I'm Emma, and I'm in the pocket of big clarity. I'm so sorry, shoot. But nevertheless, I stand.
Alright, bye everyone.
Bye. Cracked Ivory is supported by Patreon. Join us at patreon.com/crackedivorypod to receive early access to our episodes, as well as full Patreon exclusive episodes and behind-the-scenes content. Follow Talia Bad at taliabad.com and Emma Zaharuk at dolphindiaries.card.co for their solo feminist projects. Cracked Ivory is edited by Emma Zaharuk and produced by Talia Bad and Emma Zaharuk. All music is by Kevin MacLeod. Special thanks to White Mirror, Lava Monster, Axan.dev, Ceiling Fan, Yana Dunfield, Candy Barber, and Nix Taylor. Thanks for listening.